Hello and welcome to my blog, where I share with you some fascinating stories and facts about different topics. Today, we are going to explore the history of Russia, a country that spans across 2 continents and 11 time zones, and has a rich and diverse cultural heritage. Russia's history is full of amazing events, achievements, challenges, and transformations, from the ancient times to the present day. Let's dive into this incredible journey and learn more about this fascinating country. The history of Russia begins with the history of the East Slavs, the ancestors of most modern Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. The East Slavs lived in the vast forests and steppes of Eastern Europe, between the Baltic Sea and the Ural Mountains. They were divided into several tribes, each with its own language, culture, and religion. They had contacts and trade with other peoples, such as the Scandinavians, the Byzantines, the Turks, and the Mongols. One of the most important events in the early history of Russia was the establishment of the Rus state in the 9th century. The Rus state was founded by a group of Varangians, or Norsemen, who came from Scandinavia and settled among the East Slavs. They established a dynasty of rulers, known as the Rurikids, who unified the various tribes under their authority. The first capital of the Rus state was Novgorod, a prosperous city on the Volkhov River. Later, in 882, Prince Oleg of Novgorod moved the capital to Kiev, a strategic city on the Dnieper River. Kiev became the center of a powerful and wealthy state that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The Rus state adopted Christianity from the Byzantine Empire in 988 under the rule of Prince Vladimir the Great. This was a major turning point in the history of Russia, as it marked the beginning of a close cultural and religious connection with Byzantium, which influenced many aspects of Russian art, architecture, literature, and law. The Rus state also developed a unique form of writing, called Cyrillic, which is still used today by many Slavic languages. The Golden Age of Kiev lasted until the 12th century, when internal conflicts and external invasions weakened the state. The Mongols invaded Russia in 1237 to 1240 and destroyed many cities, including Kiev. They established a vast empire that ruled over most of Asia and Eastern Europe for more than 2 centuries. The Rus princes had to pay tribute to the Mongol Khans and accept their supremacy. However, they also retained some degree of autonomy and continued to rule their own lands. One of the princes who resisted the Mongol domination was Alexander Nevsky, who became a national hero and a saint in Russian history. He defended Novgorod from Swedish and German invaders in 1240 to 1242 and negotiated favorable terms with the Mongols. He also promoted cooperation among the Russian princes and encouraged cultural development. After Alexander Nevsky's death in 1263, his son Daniel founded Moscow as a small town on the Moskva River. Moscow gradually grew in size and importance as a political and religious center of Russia. Under Ivan I, 1328 to 1340, Moscow became the chief collector of tribute for the Mongols and gained influence over other Russian principalities. Under Ivan III, 1462 to 1505, Moscow stopped paying tribute to the Mongols in 1480 and asserted its independence. Ivan III also expanded Moscow's territory by annexing Novgorod, Tver, Ryazan, and other lands. He also married Sophia Palaiologina, a niece of the last Byzantine emperor, and adopted some elements of Byzantine culture and symbolism for Moscow. Ivan III was followed by his son Vasily III, 1505 to 1533, and his grandson Ivan IV, 1533 to 1584, who became known as Ivan the Terrible for his cruel and tyrannical rule. Ivan IV was crowned as Tsar, or Tsar, a title derived from Caesar, in 1547. He was also the first ruler to use the term Russia for his state. He continued to expand Russia's borders by conquering Kazan, Astrakhan, Siberia, Livonia, and other regions. He also reformed Russia's administration, law code, army, church, and trade. However, Ivan IV also faced many problems and challenges during his reign. He suffered from mental instability and paranoia and killed many people whom he suspected of treason or disloyalty. He even killed his own son Ivan in a fit of rage in 1581. He also faced rebellions, famines, epidemics, and foreign invasions. In 1582, after the Livonian War with Poland and Sweden, Russia lost her far northern territories and her access to the Baltic. When Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, Russia was left in a state of almost total political and economic ruin. The death of Ivan the Terrible was followed by a period of turmoil and anarchy known as the Time of Troubles. The Rurik dynasty came to an end with the death of Ivan's son Fyodor I in 1598. Several pretenders claimed the throne, including a man who called himself Dmitry, the son of Ivan IV, who had supposedly escaped his father's wrath in 1581. This false Dmitry gained support from Poland and some Russian nobles, but he was killed by a rival faction in 1606. Another false Dmitry appeared in 1607 and led a rebellion until he was killed in 1610. Meanwhile, Russia was invaded by Poland, Sweden, and the Ottoman Empire. The Polish army occupied Moscow and supported their own candidate for the Russian throne. The Russian people suffered from famine, plague, and violence. In 1611 to 1612, a patriotic movement led by Prince Dmitry Pozharsky and merchant Kuzma Minin organized a volunteer army that drove out the Polish invaders and liberated Moscow. In 1613, a National Assembly elected Mikhail Romanov as the new Tsar of Russia. He was a distant relative of Ivan IV and the founder of the Romanov dynasty that would rule Russia for 3 centuries. The Romanovs restored stability and order to Russia after the time of troubles. They also expanded Russia's territory and power through wars, diplomacy, colonization, and reforms. Under Peter the Great, 1682 to 1725, Russia became a major European power that challenged Sweden, Poland, Turkey, and Persia. Peter the Great also modernized Russia's administration, army, navy, industry, trade, education, and culture. He built a new capital city in St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea and made Russia part of the Western civilization. Peter the Great was succeeded by his wife Catherine I, 1725 to 1727, and his daughter Elizabeth, 1741 to 1762, who continued his policies and patronized arts and sciences. Elizabeth's nephew Peter III, 1762, was overthrown by his wife Catherine II, 1762 to 1796, who became known as Catherine the Great. She was one of the most enlightened and powerful rulers of Russia, who expanded Russia's borders through wars against Turkey and Poland. She also reformed Russia's law code, administration, education, and culture. She supported the arts and sciences and corresponded with many European philosophers such as Voltaire and Diderot. Catherine the Great's son Paul I, 1796 to 1801, was assassinated by a group of nobles who feared his autocratic tendencies. He was replaced by his son Alexander I, 1801 to 1825, who faced one of the greatest challenges in Russian history, the invasion of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1812. Napoleon's army of about 600,000 men marched into Russia with the intention of conquering it. However, they were met with fierce resistance from the Russian army and militia, who used scorched earth tactics to deprive them of supplies and shelter. The turning point of the war was the Battle of Borodino on 7 September 1812, where both sides suffered heavy casualties, but neither gained a decisive victory. Napoleon entered Moscow on 14 September, but found it mostly abandoned and burned by the Russians. He waited for Alexander to surrender, but he never did. Napoleon realized that he had to retreat before winter came, but it was too late. His army was harassed by Russian attacks and suffered from cold, hunger, disease, and desertion. Only about 100,000 men survived the retreat from Russia. The defeat of Napoleon boosted Russia's prestige and influence in Europe. Alexander I became one of the leaders of the Congress system that aimed to preserve peace and stability after the Napoleonic Wars. He also initiated some liberal reforms in Russia's administration, education, finance, and trade. However, he also faced opposition from conservative nobles who feared losing their privileges and from radical intellectuals who demanded more radical changes. In 1825, after Alexander's death without an heir, a group of young army officers who belonged to secret societies that advocated for political and social reforms staged a revolt against the new Tsar, Nicholas I. They wanted to install his brother Constantine, who had renounced the throne, as a constitutional monarch and to abolish serfdom and grant civil rights to the people. They also hoped to gain support from the lower classes and the national minorities. This revolt became known as the Decembrist Revolt because it took place on 14th December, 26th December in the New Style calendar in St. Petersburg. The Decembrists gathered at the Senate Square with about 3,000 soldiers and refused to swear allegiance to Nicholas I. They shouted, "Long live Constantine," and the Constitution, and demanded that the Tsar sign a constitution that would limit his power and guarantee the rights of the citizens. They also tried to persuade other regiments to join their cause. However, they were poorly organized and lacked a clear leader. Their plan was based on false assumptions and unrealistic expectations. They did not have any contact with Constantine, who had no intention of becoming a constitutional monarch. They also did not have any support from the masses, who were either indifferent or loyal to Nicholas I. They also underestimated the strength and determination of Nicholas I, who was a staunch conservative and a firm believer in absolute monarchy. Nicholas I ordered his loyal troops to surround the Senate Square and to disperse the rebels by force if necessary. He also sent his envoy, General Mikhail Miloradovich, to negotiate with the Decembrists and convince them to surrender peacefully. However, Miloradovich was shot and killed by one of the Decembrists, Pyotr Kakhovsky, who hoped to provoke a general uprising. This act only enraged Nicholas I, and made him more determined to crush the revolt. He gave the order to open fire with heavy artillery on the rebels, who were armed only with swords and muskets. The Decembrists tried to resist, but they were soon overwhelmed by the superior firepower of the loyalists. Many of them were killed or wounded, while others fled or were captured. The Decembrist revolt was a failure, but it had a lasting impact on Russian history and culture. It was the first attempt to challenge the autocratic system of Russia and to create a more democratic and progressive society. It inspired many future generations of Russian revolutionaries, reformers, writers, and artists who admired the courage and idealism of the Decembrists. It also exposed the deep social and political problems that plagued Russia and made Nicholas I more paranoid and repressive. He launched a campaign of harsh repression against any sign of dissent or opposition. He also strengthened his secret police, censorship, and bureaucracy. He rejected any reforms that would threaten his absolute power or undermine the traditional values of Russia. The Decembrist revolt was a tragic but heroic episode in Russian history that showed that some Russians were willing to sacrifice their lives for a better future for their country. It also marked the beginning of a long and difficult struggle for freedom and justice in Russia that would last for more than a century. A few questions and their answers. What was life like for ordinary Russians during this time period? You may wonder what was life like for ordinary Russians during this time period. How did they cope with the wars, the reforms, the revolutions, and the changes that shaped their country? Well, the answer is not simple, because Russia was a very diverse and complex society with different regions, classes, ethnicities, religions, and cultures. However, we can try to get a glimpse of some aspects of their daily lives by looking at some sources and examples. One of the most numerous and important groups in Russia was the peasantry, who made up about 80% of the population in the 19th century. The peasants lived mainly in rural villages, where they cultivated the land and raised animals. They also engaged in various crafts, such as weaving, pottery, carpentry, and metalwork. They had a strong sense of community and tradition, and followed the Orthodox Christian faith and rituals. They also had their own folklore, music, dances, and festivals. The peasants' life was not easy. They had to endure harsh weather conditions, poor soil quality, crop failures, famines, epidemics, and taxes. They also had to deal with the social and political system that governed their status and rights. Until 1861, most of the peasants were serfs, who were legally bound to their landlords and had to work on their estates and pay them rent or labor services. They had no freedom of movement or choice of occupation. They were also subject to the landlord's authority and justice, which could be arbitrary and cruel. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 was a major reform that aimed to improve the peasants' condition and stimulate the economic development of Russia. The reform granted the peasants personal freedom and gave them land from their former landlords. However, the reform also had many flaws and limitations. The peasants had to pay a high compensation to their landlords for the land they received, which put them in debt for decades. The land they received was often insufficient or of poor quality. They also had to share it with their village community, which controlled their use of land and resources. They also faced discrimination and hostility from other social groups, such as the nobility, the bureaucracy, and the urban dwellers. The peasants' reaction to the emancipation was mixed. Some welcomed it as a chance to improve their lives and participate in the modernization of Russia. They tried to increase their productivity, diversify their crops, acquire new skills, join cooperatives, or migrate to other regions or cities in search of better opportunities. Others resisted it as a threat to their traditional way of life and values. They clung to their customs, beliefs, and practices, and opposed any changes that would disrupt their communal harmony or challenge their authority. Some even rebelled against the reform and its consequences, such as higher taxes or land disputes. They staged protests, riots, or violent attacks against landlords, officials, or outsiders. The peasants' situation changed again in 1906 to 1917, when another series of reforms were introduced by the government in response to the 1905 revolution. These reforms abolished the redemption payments that the peasants had to pay for their land since 1861. They also gave them more land from the state or from private owners. They also granted them more political rights and representation in local councils or in the national parliament. These reforms improved the peasants' economic and social conditions to some extent, but they also increased their expectations and demands for more radical changes. The peasants became more active and involved in political movements and parties that advocated for land redistribution. What was the 1905 revolution? You may wonder what was the 1905 revolution and why it was so important for Russian history. The 1905 revolution involved different social groups and political movements that had different goals and demands. Some wanted to overthrow the Tsar and establish a republic or a socialist state. Others wanted to limit the Tsar's power and create a constitutional monarchy with a parliament and civil rights. Some wanted to improve the economic and social conditions of the workers, peasants, and minorities. Others wanted to gain more autonomy or independence for their regions or nations. The 1905 revolution challenged the Tsarist regime on many fronts and forced it to make some concessions and reforms. The most significant of these was the October Manifesto, issued by Tsar Nicholas II on 17 October 1905. The October Manifesto promised to grant some civil liberties, such as freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion, to the Russian people. It also promised to create an elected assembly, called the State Duma, that would have legislative power and represent different classes and parties. The October Manifesto was seen by some as a step toward democracy and modernization in Russia. However, the October Manifesto did not satisfy everyone and did not end the 1905 revolution. Many revolutionaries rejected it as too little too late and continued to fight for more radical changes. They also distrusted the Tsar's sincerity and feared that he would not keep his promises or that he would try to undermine the Duma's authority. They also faced opposition from the conservative forces that supported the Tsar and his absolute power. These included the army, the police, the bureaucracy, the church, and the nationalist groups known as the Black Hundreds. The 1905 revolution lasted until mid-1906, when it was finally suppressed by the Tsarist regime with military force and political repression. Many revolutionaries were killed, wounded, arrested, exiled, or executed. The Duma was convened in April 1906, but it had limited power and influence over the government. The Tsar also issued a new constitution in 1906 called the Fundamental Laws that restricted the Duma's role and reaffirmed his autocratic rule. The 1905 revolution was a turning point in Russian history that showed that the Tsarist regime was no longer able to maintain its legitimacy and stability in the face of social and political changes. It also showed that many Russians were ready to challenge the old order and demand a new one that would reflect their aspirations and interests. It also inspired many future generations of Russian revolutionaries who would continue to fight for freedom and justice in Russia. Who were some famous Russian writers and artists? You may wonder who were some famous Russian writers and artists and how they contributed to the world's culture and literature. Russia has produced many great writers and artists who have enriched the human civilization with their works of genius and creativity. They have explored various themes, styles, genres, and forms of expression, and have influenced many other writers and artists around the world. Here are some of the most famous Russian writers and artists that you should know about. One of the best-known Russian writers is Leo Tolstoy, 1828-1910, who is considered one of the greatest novelists of all time. He wrote epic novels such as War and Peace, 1869, and Anna Karenina, 1877, which depict the life and society of Russia in the 19th century with realism, depth, and moral insight. He also wrote short stories, essays, and philosophical works, such as The Death of Ivan Ilyich, 1886, and The Kingdom of God is Within You, 1894, which express his views on religion, ethics, and nonviolence. Another famous Russian writer is Fyodor Dostoevsky, 1821-1881, who is regarded as one of the founders of existentialism and psychology in literature. He wrote novels such as Crime and Punishment, 1866, The Idiot, 1869, The Brothers Karamazov, 1880, and Notes from Underground, 1864, which explore the themes of free will, guilt, sin, redemption, suffering, and human nature. He also wrote short stories, essays, and memoirs, such as The House of the Dead, 1862, and The Gambler, 1867, which reflect his own experiences of imprisonment, poverty, gambling, and epilepsy. A third famous Russian writer is Anton Chekhov, 1860-1904, who is considered one of the masters of short stories and modern drama. He wrote hundreds of short stories, such as The Lady with the Dog, 1899, The Bet, 1889, The Darling, 1899, and The Seagull, 1896, which portray the lives of ordinary people with humor, irony, compassion, and realism. He also wrote plays, such as The Cherry Orchard, 1904, Uncle Vanya, 1899, Three Sisters, 1901, and The Seagull, 1896, which revolutionized the theater with their subtle characterization, dialogue, and action. One of the most famous Russian artists is Ivan Ayvazovsky, 1817-1900, who is known for his paintings of seascapes and landscapes. He painted over 6,000 works, many of which depict the sea in different moods, times, and places. He also painted historical scenes, portraits, and oriental subjects. He was admired for his mastery of light, color, and movement in his paintings. Some of his most famous works are The Ninth Wave, 1850, Storm, 1886, Brig Mercury attacked by two Turkish ships, 1892, and Moonlit Seascape with Shipwreck, 1849, 34. Another famous Russian artist is Vasily Kandinsky, 1866 to 1944, who is considered one of the pioneers of abstract art. He was influenced by various artistic movements, such as Impressionism, Expressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, and Futurism. He experimented with different forms, colors, shapes, and symbols in his paintings. He also wrote theoretical works on art, such as Concerning the Spiritual in Art, 1911, and Point and Line to Playing, 1926. Some of his most famous works are Composition 7, 1913, Improvisation 28, 1912, On White 2, 1923, and Yellow-Red Blue, 1925, 34. A famous Russian artist is Mark Chagall, 1887 to 1985, who was a painter. What was the role of women in Russian literature? You may wonder what was the role of women in Russian literature and how they contributed to the development and diversity of this field. Women have played a significant and active role in Russian literature, both as writers and as characters, since the 18th century. They have expressed their views, experiences, emotions, and aspirations through various literary genres and forms. They have also challenged and enriched the dominant literary traditions and discourses of their times. Here are some of the main aspects and examples of the role of women in Russian literature. One of the first women writers in Russian literature was Anna Bunina, 1774 to 1829, who was also the first Russian woman to publish a volume of poetry. She wrote lyrical poems that reflected her personal feelings, thoughts, and observations. She also wrote satirical poems that criticized the social and political issues of her time, such as the oppression of women, the corruption of the nobility, and the wars with France. She faced many difficulties and prejudices as a woman writer, but she also gained recognition and admiration from some of her contemporaries, such as Alexander Pushkin. Another pioneer of women's writing in Russian literature was Nadezhda Durova, 1783 to 1866, who was also known as the Cavalry Maiden. She was a woman who disguised herself as a man and joined the Russian army during the Napoleonic Wars. She fought bravely and skillfully in several battles and received medals and honors for her service. She also wrote memoirs about her life and adventures, which were published in 1836 with the help of Pushkin. Her memoirs are considered one of the first examples of autobiographical writing by a Russian woman. They also provide a unique perspective on the history and culture of Russia in the early 19th century. One of the most influential and prolific women writers in Russian literature was Evgenia Tur, 1815 to 1892, who wrote novels, short stories, essays, and literary criticism. She was one of the founders of Russian realism, a literary movement that aimed to depict life as it is, with its joys and sorrows, virtues and vices, problems and solutions. She wrote about various topics and themes, such as family, education, society, religion, art, and history. She also wrote about women's issues, such as their rights, roles, opportunities, and challenges. She advocated for women's education, emancipation, and equality. She also mentored and supported many young women writers, such as Elena Gan. One of the most famous and popular women writers in Russian literature was Elena Gan, 1814 to 1842, who was also known as Rostovina. She wrote poems, novels, short stories, plays, and essays that expressed her romantic sensibility, wit, humor, and irony. She also wrote about women's issues. How did Russia become a communist state? You may wonder, how did Russia become a communist state, and what were the consequences of this transformation? Communism is a political and economic ideology that calls for a classless, government-controlled society where everything is shared equally. Communism was inspired by the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who published the Communist Manifesto in 1881. They argued that capitalism, the system based on private ownership and profit, would inevitably lead to exploitation, inequality, and conflict. They predicted that the working class, or the proletariat, would rise up against the ruling class, or the bourgeoisie, and create a socialist society where the means of production would be owned by the workers. They also envisioned that socialism would eventually evolve into communism, where there would be no need for money, classes, or states. The first major nation to adopt communism was Russia, in 1917. Russia had been ruled by an absolute monarchy, known as the Tsarist regime, for centuries. The Tsarist regime was oppressive, corrupt, and backward. It faced many problems and challenges, such as poverty, illiteracy, famine, industrialization, nationalism, and war. The Russian people were unhappy and discontented with their living conditions and their lack of rights and freedoms. They also resented the Tsar's involvement in World War I, which drained Russia's resources and caused millions of casualties. In February 1917, a revolution broke out in Russia that overthrew the Tsarist regime and established a provisional government. The provisional government was led by moderate liberals and socialists who wanted to reform Russia and make it a democratic republic. However, they also faced opposition from radical socialists who wanted to overthrow capitalism and create a socialist state. The most influential of these radicals were the Bolsheviks, a faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party that followed the ideas of Marxism. The Bolsheviks were led by Vladimir Lenin, who returned to Russia from exile with the help of Germany. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks staged a coup d'état against the provisional government and seized power in Russia. They proclaimed themselves as the representatives of the workers' councils, or Soviets, that had emerged during the revolution. They also declared Russia as a socialist republic and announced their intention to build communism in Russia. They withdrew Russia from World War I by signing a peace treaty with Germany. They also confiscated land from the nobility and the church and distributed it among the peasants. They nationalized banks, factories, mines, railways, and other industries. They abolished private property and introduced a planned economy. They also created a one-party dictatorship that suppressed any opposition or dissent. The Bolsheviks' revolution was not welcomed by everyone in Russia or abroad. Many Russians opposed their policies and their methods. They faced resistance from various groups and factions that formed an anti-Bolshevik coalition known as the White Army. They also faced intervention from foreign powers that supported the White Army or had their own interests in Russia. The Bolsheviks fought a civil war against their enemies from 1918 to 1921 that resulted in millions of deaths and widespread devastation. The Bolsheviks managed to win the civil war and consolidate their power in Russia. They also expanded their influence to other former territories of the Russian Empire that had declared their independence after the revolution. In 1922, what are the economic resources of Russia? You may wonder what are the economic resources of Russia and how they affect its development and prosperity. Economic resources are the natural, human, and capital assets that a country can use to produce goods and services. Russia has a variety of economic resources that make it one of the largest and most powerful economies in the world. Let's take a look at some of these resources and their role in Russia's economy. One of the most important economic resources of Russia is its natural resources, especially its energy resources. Russia has enormous reserves of oil, natural gas, coal, and uranium, which account for 95.7% of its national wealth. Russia is the world's largest producer and exporter of natural gas, the second largest producer and exporter of oil, and the third largest producer and exporter of coal. These energy resources provide Russia with a significant source of income as well as a strategic advantage in international relations. They also enable Russia to meet its domestic energy needs and to develop its industries and infrastructure. However, Russia's dependence on natural resources also poses some challenges and risks for its economy. For example, Russia's oil and gas revenues are highly volatile and depend on global market prices and demand, which can fluctuate due to various factors, such as economic cycles, geopolitical events, technological innovations, or environmental issues. This can affect Russia's fiscal stability and economic growth. Moreover, Russia's natural resources are unevenly distributed across its vast territory, which creates regional disparities and logistical difficulties. Furthermore, Russia's natural resources are finite and non-renewable, which means that they will eventually run out or become more costly to extract. Therefore, Russia needs to diversify its economy and invest in other sectors and sources of income. Another important economic resource of Russia is its human capital, or the skills, knowledge, and abilities of its population. Russia has a large and educated population of about 147 million people. Russia has a high literacy rate of 99.7% and a high enrollment rate in primary, secondary, and tertiary education too. Russia also has a strong tradition of scientific and technological innovation and achievement, as well as a rich and diverse cultural heritage. These factors contribute to Russia's potential for economic development and social progress. However, Russia's human capital also faces some challenges and constraints that limit its productivity and competitiveness. For example, Russia's population is aging and declining due to low birth rates, high mortality rates, emigration, and poor health conditions. This can reduce the size and quality of Russia's labor force and increase the burden on its social security system. Moreover, Russia's education system suffers from some problems, such as outdated curricula, inadequate funding, unequal access, corruption, or brain drain. Furthermore, Russia's innovation system is hampered by some barriers, such as insufficient research and development spending, weak intellectual property rights protection, bureaucratic red tape, or lack of cooperation between academia and industry. Therefore, Russia needs to improve its demographic situation and healthcare system, reform its education system and innovation system, and foster a more conducive environment for human capital development. A third important economic resource of Russia is its capital stock, or the physical assets that it can use to produce goods and services. Russia has a large and diverse capital stock that includes various types of infrastructure, such as roads, railways, ports, airports, pipelines, power plants, telecommunications networks, water supply systems, etc. It also includes various types of machinery and equipment that are used in different sectors and industries. These capital assets enable Russia to produce a wide range of products and services that meet its domestic needs and external demands. They also support Russia's economic growth and competitiveness. However, Russia's capital stock also suffers from some deficiencies and inefficiencies that affect its performance and quality. For example, Russia's infrastructure is often outdated. What are the main industries in Russia? You may wonder what are the main industries in Russia and how they contribute to its economy and development. Industries are economic activities that involve the production and distribution of goods and services. Russia has a variety of industries that make use of its natural, human, and capital resources. Some of these industries are more competitive and profitable than others, and some face more challenges and risks than others. Let's take a look at some of the main industries in Russia and their role in its economy. One of the main industries in Russia is the oil and gas industry, which is part of the natural resources sector. Russia has enormous reserves of oil and natural gas, which account for 95.7% of its national wealth. Russia is the world's largest producer and exporter of natural gas, the second largest producer and exporter of oil, and the third largest producer and exporter of coal. These energy resources provide Russia with a significant source of income, as well as a strategic advantage in international relations. They also enable Russia to meet its domestic energy needs and to develop its industries and infrastructure. However, the oil and gas industry also poses some challenges and risks for Russia's economy. For example, Russia's oil and gas revenues are highly volatile and depend on global market prices and demand, which can fluctuate due to various factors, such as economic cycles, geopolitical events, technological innovations, or environmental issues. This can affect Russia's fiscal stability and economic growth. Moreover, Russia's oil and gas resources are unevenly distributed across its vast territory, which creates regional disparities and logistical difficulties. Furthermore, Russia's oil and gas resources are finite and non-renewable, which means that they will eventually run out or become more costly to extract. Therefore, Russia needs to diversify its economy and invest in other sectors and sources of income. Another main industry in Russia is the manufacturing industry, which is part of the industrial sector. Manufacturing involves the transformation of raw materials into finished products that can be sold or used. Russia has a large and diverse manufacturing industry that includes various types of products, such as machinery, equipment, vehicles, aircraft, ships, weapons, chemicals, metals, textiles, food, beverages, etc. These products serve both domestic and foreign markets and support other industries in Russia. They also reflect Russia's scientific and technological capabilities and achievements. However, the manufacturing industry also faces some challenges and constraints that affect its productivity and competitiveness. For example, Russia's manufacturing industry suffers from low efficiency. How does Russia's economy compare to other countries? Russia has a large and diverse economy that is based on its natural resources, especially its energy resources, as well as its manufacturing, services, and agriculture sectors. Russia is the 11th largest economy in the world, with a GDP of about 1.7 to 1.8 trillion US dollars in 2019 and to 0 to 112. Russia ranks between South Korea and Australia in nominal GDP, and behind Canada, Italy and Brazil in overall GDP. Russia's economy has faced many challenges and changes in the past decades, such as the transition from communism to capitalism, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the 1998 financial crisis, the 2008 global recession, the 2014 sanctions and oil price shock, and the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. These events have affected Russia's economic performance, stability, and growth. Russia's economy has also been influenced by its political system, which is characterized by a strong central government, a dominant presidential power, a weak rule of law, and a high level of corruption. Russia's economy has some strengths and advantages that make it competitive and resilient. For example, Russia has enormous reserves of oil, natural gas, coal, and uranium, which account for 95.7% of its national wealth. Russia is the world's largest producer and exporter of natural gas, the second largest producer and exporter of oil, and the third largest producer and exporter of coal. These energy resources provide Russia with a significant source of income as well as a strategic advantage in international relations. They also enable Russia to meet its domestic energy needs and to develop its industries and infrastructure. Russia also has a large and educated population of about 147 million people. Russia has a high literacy rate of 99.7% and a high enrollment rate in primary, secondary, and tertiary education. Russia also has a strong tradition of scientific and technological innovation and achievement, as well as a rich and diverse cultural heritage. These factors contribute to Russia's potential for economic development and social progress. However, Russia's economy also has some weaknesses and challenges that limit its productivity and competitiveness. For example, Russia's oil and gas revenues are highly volatile and depend on global market prices and demand. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new about Russian history. If you did, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this one. See you next time.